Hello, I am Anita and Thomas. Welcome you all to the session on Stoicism. Stoicism is an ancient Greek philosophy developed by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC as a refinement of cynicism, which teaches the development of self-control and fortitude as a means of overcoming destructive emotions. It does not seek to extinguish emotions completely, but rather seeks to transform them by a resolute asceticism, which enables a person to develop clear judgment, inner calm, and freedom from suffering. Stoicism is not just a set of beliefs or ethical claims, but rather a way of life involving constant practice and training and incorporating the practice of logic, Socratic dialogue and self-dialogues, contemplation of death, and a kind of meditation aimed at training one's attention to remain in the present moment. The term Stoic was taken from the Stoa Poikile, meaning painted porch, where Zeno of Citium used to teach. In modern usage, the word refers to someone who is unemotional or indifferent to pain, pleasure, grief, or joy, and has little in common with its philosophical roots. As an ethical doctrine, the goal of Stoicism is freedom from passion through the pursuit of reason and apatheia. It teaches indifference and a passive reaction to external events and equanimity in the face of life's highs and lows. The Stoics taught that becoming a clear, unbiased, and self-disciplined thinker allows one to understand the logos, the natural universal reason in all things. Thus, unhappiness and evil are the results of ignorance, and if someone is unkind, it is because they are unaware of their own universal reason. The solution to this evil and unhappiness can be achieved through the practice of Stoic philosophy. Hence, the famous Stoic maxim, "Live according to nature," both in sense of the laws of the universe and of man, owns essential nature, reason. In many respects, it bears a remarkable similarity to the ethical teaching of Siddhartha Gautama and Buddhism, which is grounded in the Four Noble Truths: all life has suffering, suffering is rooted in passion and desire, happiness is freedom from the passions, moral restraint and self-discipline are the means by which one becomes free from suffering. An important aspect of Stoicism involves improving the individual's ethical and moral well-being by having a will which is in agreement with nature and by practicing the four cardinal virtues derived from the teachings of Plato: wisdom, Sophia, courage, Andrea, justice, Dikaiosine, and temperance, Sophrosine. For the Stoics, living according to reason and virtue are to live in harmony with the divine order of the universe and recognizing the common reason and essential value of all people. They therefore promoted egalitarianism and, unusually for their day, encouraged the acceptance of even slaves as equals on grounds that all the sons of God, echoing Socrates' claim that "I am not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world." They also denied the importance of external differences such as rank and wealth in social relationships. To some extent, Stoicism assumes determinism in that it holds that we will in any case do as the necessity of the world compels us, but it holds that we should not merely obey the law, but assent to our own obedience and follow the law consciously and deliberately as only a rational being can. The 1st century AD Roman philosopher and Stoic Seneca the Younger 4 BC to AD 65, the most famous and popular philosopher of his day took the subject of anger seriously enough to dedicate a whole book to the subject. He saw anger as a philosophical problem and amenable to treatment by philosophical argument, not just an irrational outburst over which we have no control. He thought that anger arose from holding overly optimistic ideas about the world, leading to unrealistic expectations, and advised a more pessimistic attitude so that one was mentally prepared for the kinds of bad things that happen, which would therefore not lead to such outbursts of anger. Philosophical antecedents. Stoicism is a Hellenistic eudaimonic philosophy, which means that we can expect it to be influenced by its immediate predecessors and contemporaries, as well as being in open critical dialogue with them. These includes Socratic thinking, as it is arrived at us mainly through the early Platonic dialogues, the Platonism of the academic school, particularly in its skeptical phase, Aristotelianism of the peripatetic school, cynicism, skepticism, and Epicureanism. It is worth noting, in order to put things into context, that a quantitative study of the extant records concerning known philosophers of the ancient Greco-Roman world estimates that the leading schools of the time were in descending order: academics, Platonists 19%, Stoics 12%, Epicureans 8%, and Peripatetics Aristotelians 6%. Eudaimonia was the term that meant a life worth living, often translated nowadays as happiness in the broad sense, or more appropriately, flourishing. For the Greco-Romans, this often involved excellence at moral virtues. The idea is therefore closely related to that of virtue ethics, an approach most famously associated with Aristotle and his Nicomachean ethics, and revived in modern times by a number of philosophers, including Philippa Foot 2001 and Alasdair MacIntyre 2013. Stoicism is best understood in the context of the differences among similar schools of the time. Socrates had argued that virtue, and in particular the four cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, are the only good. Everything else is neither good nor bad in and of itself. By contrast, for Aristotle, the virtues were necessary but not sufficient for eudaimonia. One also needed a certain degree of positive goods such as health, wealth, education, and even a bit of good looks. In other words, Aristotle expounded the rather commonsensical notion that a flourishing life is part effort, because one can and ought to cultivate one's character, and part luck in form of the physical and cultural conditions that affect and shape one's life. Contrast this to the rather take of the cynics, who not only thought that virtue was the only good, like Socrates, but that the additional goods that Aristotle was worried about were actually distractions and needed to be positively avoided. Cynics like Diogenes of Sinope were famous for their ascetic and, shall we say, rather eclectic lifestyle, as is epitomized by a story about him told by Diogenes Laertius. One day, observing a child drinking out of his hands, he cast away the cup from his wallet with the words, "A child has beaten me in plainness of living." One way to think of this is that the Aristotelian approach comes across as a bit too aristocratic. If one does not have certain privileges in life, one cannot achieve eudaimonia. By contrast, the Cynics were preaching a rather extremely minimalist lifestyle, which is hard to practice for most human beings. What the Stoics tried to do then was to strike a balance in the middle by endorsing the twin crucial ideas on which I will elaborate later, that virtue is the only true good in itself, sufficient for eudaimonia regardless of one's circumstances, but also that other things may be rationally preferred, proigmena, or dispreferred, apoproigmena, as in the case of sickness, ignorance and poverty, as long as one did not confuse them for things with inherent value. Greek Stoicism. The Greek phase of the Stoa covers the first and second periods from the founding of the school by Zeno to the shifting of the center of gravity from Athens to Rome in the time of Posidonius in the 1st century BC, who became a friend of Cicero. Stoicism was not just born but flourished in Athens, even though most of its exponents originated from the eastern Mediterranean. Zeno from Citium, modern Cyprus, Cleanthes from Assos, modern western Turkey, and Chrysippus from Soli, modern southern Turkey, among others. From the beginning, Stoicism was squarely a Socratic philosophy, and the Stoics themselves did not mind such a label. Zeno began his studies under the Cynic Crates, and Cynicism always had a strong influence on Stoicism all the way to the latest writing of Epictetus. But Zeno also counted among his teachers Polemo, the head of the academy, and Stilpo of the Megarian school founded by Euclid of Megaria, a pupil of Socrates. This is relevant because Zeno came to elaborate a philosophy that was both of clear Socratic inspiration and a compromise between Polemus and Stilpo's positions, as the first one endorsed the idea that there are external goods, while the second one claimed that nothing external can be good or bad. That compromise consisted in the uniquely Stoic notion that external goods are of ethically neutral value, but are nonetheless the object of natural pursuit. Zeno established the tripartite study of Stoic philosophy comprising ethics, physics, and logic. The ethics was basically a moderate version of cynicism. The physics was influenced by Plato's Timaeus and encompassed a universe permeated by an active and a passive principle, as well as a cosmic web of cause and effect. The logic included both what we today refer to as formal logic and epistemology, that is, a theory of knowledge which for the Stoics were decidedly empirist naturalistic. The Stoics after Zeno disagreed on a number of issues, often interpreting Zeno's teachings differently. Perhaps the most important example is provided by the dispute between Cleanthes and Chrysippus about the unity of the virtues. Zeno had talked about each virtue in turn being a kind of wisdom, which Cleanthes interpreted in a strict unitary sense, while Chrysippus understood in a more pluralistic fashion. The early Stoic could also be stubbornly anti-ephemeral in their apologetics of Zeno's writings, as when Chrysippus insisted in defending the idea that the heart, not the brain, is the seat of intelligence. This went against pretty conclusive anatomical evidence that was already available in the Hellenistic period and earned the Stoics the scorn of Galen, though later Stoics did update their beliefs on the matter. Despite this faux pas, Chrysippus was arguably the most influential Stoic thinker, responsible for an overhaul of the school, which had declined under the guidance of Cleanthes, a broad systematization of its teachings, and the introduction of a number of novel notions in logic, the aspect of Stoicism that has had the most technical philosophical impact in the long run. In the 6 decades following Chrysippus, there were just 2 heads of the Stoa, Zeno of Tarsus, south-central Turkey, and Diogenes of Babylon, whose contributions were rather less significant than those of Chrysippus himself. We have to wait until 155 BCE for the next impactful event, when the heads of the 3 major schools in Athens were sent by the city to Rome in order to help with diplomatic efforts. The philosophers in question, including the Stoic Diogenes of Babylon, made a huge impression of the Roman public with their public performances, paving the road for the latest shift of philosophy from Athens to Rome, as well as to other centers of learning like Alexandria. Beginning with Antipater of Tarsus and then more obviously Panaetius and Posidonius, the Stoics revisited their relationship with the academy, especially in light of the above-mentioned importance of the Timaeus for Stoic cosmology. Apparently, what particularly interested Posidonius was the fact that Plato's main character in the dialogue is Pythagorean, a school that Posidonius somewhat anachronistically managed to link to Stoicism. It appears that the broader project pursued by both Panaetius and Posidonius was one of seeking common ground among academicism, Aristotelianism, and Stoicism itself, that is, the 3 branches of Socratic philosophy. This process seemed to have been in part responsible for the furthest success of Stoicism, once the major philosophers of the various schools moved from Athens to Rome after the diaspora of 88 to 86 BC. Roman Stoicism. If the visit to Rome by the head of various philosophical schools in 155 BCE was crucial for bringing philosophy to the attention of the Romans, the political events of 88 to 86 BCE changed the course in Western philosophy in general and Stoicism in particular for the remainder of antiquity. At that time, philosophers, particularly the Peripatetic Athenian and the Epicurean Aristion, were politically in charge at Athens and made the crucial mistake of siding with Mithridates against Rome. The defeat of the king of Pontus and consequently of Athens spelled disaster for the latter and led to a diaspora of philosophers throughout the Mediterranean. To be fair, we have no evidence of the continuation of the Stoa as an actual school in Athens after Panaetius, and we know that Posidonius taught in Rhodes, not Athens. However, according to Sedley, 2003, it was the events of 88 to 86 BCE that finally and permanently moved the center of gravity of Stoicism away from its Greek cradle to Rome, Rhodes, and Tarsus, where a Stoic was at one point chosen by Augustus to govern the city. Most crucially, however, Stoicism became important in Rome during the fraught time of the transition between the late Republic and the Empire, with Cato the Younger is eventually becoming a role model of later Stoics because of his political opposition to the tyrant Julius Caesar. Sedley highlights 2 Stoic philosophers of the late 1st century BCE, Athenodorus of Tarsus and Arius Didymus as precursors of one of the greatest and most controversial Stoic figures, Seneca. Both Athenodorus and Arius were personal counselors to the first emperor Augustus, and Arius even wrote a letter of consolation to Livia, Augustus' wife, addressing the death of her son, which Seneca later hailed as a reference work of emotional therapy, the sort of work he himself engaged in and became famous for. Once we get to the imperial period, we see a decided shift away from the more theoretical aspects of Stoicism and toward more practical treatments of the ethics. However, as Gill points out, this should not lead us to think that the vitality of Stoicism had taken a nosedive by then. We know of a number of new treatises produced by Stoic writers of that period on everything ranging from ethics to physics, and the summary of the traditions of Greek theology by Cornutus is one of a handful of complete Stoic treatises to survive from any period of the history of the school. Still, it is certainly the case that the best known Stoics of the time were either teachers like Musonius, Rufus and Epictetus, or politically active like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, thus shaping our understanding of the period as a contrast to the foundational and more theoretical one of Zeno and Chrysippus. Importantly, it is from the late Republic and Empire that we also get some of the best indirect sources of Stoicism, particularly several books by Cicero and Diogenes Laertius, lives of the eminent philosophers. And this literature went on to influence later writers well after the decline of Stoicism, particularly Plotinus 205 to 270 CE and even the 6th century CE Neoplatonist Simplicius. All of the above notwithstanding, what is most vital about Stoicism during the Roman imperial period, however, is also what arguably made the philosophy's impact reverberate throughout the centuries, eventually leading to two revivals, the so-called Neo-Stoicism of the Renaissance and the current modern Stoicism movement. The sources of such vitality were fundamentally two. On the one hand, charismatic teachers like Musonius and Epictetus, and on the other hand, influential political figures like Seneca and Marcus. Indeed, Musonius was, in a sense, both. Not only he was a member of the Roman knight class and the teacher of Epictetus, he was also politically active, openly criticizing the policies of both Nero and Vespasian and getting exiled twice as a result. Others were not so lucky. Stoic philosophers suffered a series of persecutions from displeased emperors, which resulted in murders or exile for a number of them, especially during the reigns of Nero, Vespasian and Domitian. Seneca famously had to commit suicide on Nero's orders, and Epictetus was exiled to Greece by Domitian. It is also important to appreciate different styles of being Stoic among the major Roman figures. As Gill in 2003 points out, Epictetus was rather strict, arcing back to the Cynic model of quasi-asceticism. Musonius was a sometimes odd combination of conservative and progressive Stoic, advocating the importance of marriage and family, but also stating very clearly those women are just as capable of practicing virtue. Seneca was not only more open to pursuit of preferred indifference, but explicitly stated that he was critical of some doctrines of the early Stoics and that he was open to learn from other schools, including the Epicureans. Famously, Marcus Aurelius was open about theology at several points in the Meditations, 1997, explicitly stating the two alternatives of providence, Stoic doctrine, or atoms, the Epicurean take. For instance, either there is a fatal necessity and invincible order, or a kind of providence or confusion without a purpose and without a director. If then there is an invincible necessity, why do you resist? But if there is a providence that allows it to be propitiated, make yourself worthy of the help of the divinity. But if there is a confusion without a governor, be content that in such the tempest you have yourself a certain ruling intelligence, or with respect to what may happen to you from without, consider that it happens either by chance or according to providence, and you must neither blame chance nor accuse providence. More was said about the specific topic in the section on Stoic metaphysics and teleology. There is ample evidence then that Stoicism was alive and well during the Roman period, although the emphasis did shift from laying down the fundamental ideas to refining them and putting them into practice, both in personal and social life. Now, try to answer the questions. Explain the philosophy of Stoicism. Briefly narrate the origin of Stoicism. Distinguish the ideas of Stoicism and Buddhism. Narrate the reality elements of Stoicism. Critically analyze implications of Stoicism in our day-to-day life. How do Roman and Greek Stoicism differ? Who are the main proponents of Greek Stoicism? Books for reference. The Hellenistic Philosophers, 2nd volume by A. Long and D. N. Sedley, Cambridge University Press, Cambridge, 1987. Hellenistic Philosophy 2nd edition by B. Inwood and L. Gerson, Indianapolis, Hackett Publishing, 1997. Posidonius, 2nd volume by L. Edelstein and I. G. Kidd, Cambridge University Press, Cambridge, 1972. Thank you so much for watching today's program. Goodbye.